So please, for this lightning talks, we will welcome Clare Spencer. Clare Spencer is a news reporter at the Northwestern University, and she'll talk about how to critically engage with AI. Clare, please come to the stage.
Hi all. Please get your coffee and come back down here because I can't concentrate while you're talking. Thanks so much. Okay. So I'm going to talk about breaking down how you can use AI in your workplace. For the news industry, this touches on balancing speed and accuracy. It's going to be a practical look with lots of examples at how journalists can critically engage with AI. So that's understanding when to use it, how to use it effectively, and why thoughtful integration matters. A little bit about me. That picture is my LinkedIn profile picture. So if you want to connect with me, that's the picture to click on. I'm a reporter, and I work on this site, generativeAIinthenewsroom.com. I only write about how newsrooms use generative AI. The examples I'm going to go through today are all examples I've included in some of my articles. So if they're of interest to you, then you can go and take a deeper look at those examples on the site. So how did I end up in this nichiest of niche? It's an incredibly specialist niche for a reporter. I was a journalist at the BBC for more than a decade. I wrote for the BBC News website. And then I moved over to their innovation team and worked with software engineers, creating tools which use generative AI. And that was before ChatGPT came out. No one was really interested in what we were doing. And then ChatGPT came out and everyone was interested. And I went on to work for 3 other news organizations working with generative AI, experimenting, integrating it into newsrooms, and I really saw firsthand what works and what doesn't. And I felt that we need more communication within the news industry about how we should and shouldn't use generative AI. So I started this job as a reporter again, after being a product manager, after being a research and development. I went back into being a reporter. Before we start, I just want to point out a assumption I have about the news industry, and that is that good organizations prioritize accuracy over speed. So accuracy and speed are both characteristics of the news industry, of journalism. But in my experience, places like the BBC, where I worked for many years, when they have to make this trade-off between accuracy and speed, they say accuracy is more important. This came out before. This is always an issue before generative AI came out, and you can see in the BBC's guidelines, they say that outright, that accuracy is more important than speed. So what I mean is the accuracy of your content is more important than the speed at which you bring that content to your audience. But with generative AI, this comes up, this trade-off comes up all the time because generative AI promised to make content quicker, but also adds in errors. So I want to just quickly refresh before we go into it, why generative AI adds in errors. Ethan Mollick, in his book, Co-Intelligence, it describes it like this. I think it's quite an accessible way of describing it, that a large language model works by predicting the most likely words that follow a prompt you gave it based on statistical patterns in its training data. So if that doesn't make sense to you, then think of it like fancy maths. If that doesn't make sense to you, then just think there is no relationship to truth, to meaning, to fact in how large language models are designed. And although this book is a few years old, in September, OpenAI came out with some research they published, which the tech press have interpreted to say that hallucinations, what big tech tend to call adding in errors, factual inaccuracy, hallucinations are not going away. They're part of how a large language model is built. So that really matters with how we use generative AI in an industry which is essentially about telling the truth. So we can see that lots of news organizations have had to work out what do we do about this. For example, so a lot of news organizations have come out with principles. Here's one from the Associated Press news agency. And how they deal with this issue of accuracy is they say that it's the responsibility of the AP journalist to be accountable for accuracy. So that means if you use generative AI, you will have to check the output of it before you use any of that content for your stories you present to the audience. This is often called, shout it out if you can work out what this phrase is called. It's only been mentioned once so far today, unbelievably. What's my next slide going to be? It's called human in the loop. This is what I'm going to talk about today. I've worked in news organizations which say, we have a human in the loop, so that's fine. It's much more complicated than that. You can't just have a human in the loop. You can't just have a person checking. You have to really go into detail about how they check, who checks the content. And these are the questions I'm going to be asking today. So who should be the human in the loop? When should they check for accuracy? Is it definitely quicker to use generative AI than create content manually? So this is a question this third question is a question which is not so much taboo now to ask. We were promised speed, right? And then people were using generative AI and saying, is it really quicker to use generative AI? And that's a worthwhile question to ask. So I'm going to go through a whole load of examples, because this is all nice and neat and theoretical, but in the real world, it's not neat. It's mixed up with your whole business model and the rest of the information out there. And so it's better to go through examples and show what it means to have a human in the loop for real. What's a good human in the loop? What's a good practice? What's bad practice? I'm going to start off with some cautionary tales, people who've messed up, and see what we learn from that and what that teaches us about how we have a human in the loop to check for accuracy when we're using generative AI. So this is a notification that went through to people who had certain Apple phones. It says it's BBC News, but it isn't. It is Apple's summary of a BBC News notification. This guy here, does anyone know who he is? Well, it's a bit of a guess. That's a rubbish question, actually, because his name's just there. This guy's an amazing darts player from the UK. And here it says, Luke Littler won the PDC, that's the darts championship. So Luke Littler won the darts championship. The problem with this summary is that he hadn't even played the final yet. So what had happened here is that the BBC had sent out a notification about Luke Littler, which wasn't that he'd won the final. Apple's feature then summarized that notification to an extent that it was actually inaccurate. They did this tons of times. There were so many examples of these inaccurate notifications that Apple intelligence features were sending through. They said Rafael Nadal had come out as gay. He hadn't. They said that Benjamin Netanyahu had been arrested. He hadn't. They said Luigi Mangione had shot himself. He hadn't. Eventually, they pulled this and reintroduced it only recently with a few disclaimers, which makes you think, well, if you need to write a disclaimer next to it, what's the point of summarizing it? But this is a good example of how not to do the human in the loop. It's almost definite that they did not have a human checking this. I asked Apple and they didn't respond to my question about this, but these were personalized summaries, so it just wouldn't make sense logically to check every single one for your personal summary. I mean, so to teach us how not to do the human in the loop checking for accuracy and ensuring accuracy, first of all, generative AI is not accurate enough to not have a human check. If your content needs to be accurate, right? And then what this teaches us really that is about what we had this promise of personalization. Generative AI may bring personalization. Well, if you have a human in the loop checking everything, it really does restrict your possibilities of personalization and scaling up the reformatting of your content. And this is the cautionary tale to teach us what goes wrong when you do scale up and personalize using generative AI. The next cautionary tale comes from the Chicago Sun-Times supplement from May. So this is a book reviewer who is on social media as Tina Books. She reads a lot of books and recommends books to her followers. They tend to be fictional, nice, light summer reads. She got a message from her friend saying, I think you need to check the Chicago Sun-Times latest edition. There's something fishy going on. She opens up this summer reading list for 2025 with 15 recommendations for books. And she knows, because she's an expert on the latest fiction, she knows that almost all of these books are not actual fictional books that you can buy in the bookshop. They have titles that don't exist. All the authors are real, and the descriptions are made up as well. All in all, only 5 of them were real books. So what had gone wrong here? So a freelance journalist came out, when this went viral when she shared it, and a freelance journalist who wrote this came out and said, yeah, I wrote this. I used ChatGPT. And he clearly didn't check anything in that. He just put something through ChatGPT. He then submitted it to King Features, who then submitted it who were part of a wider Hearst publishing, who had been outsourced by Chicago Sun-Times. So there was this long chain of people involved. And the last person in that chain was this freelancer who was doing it in his evenings, by the way. He had a full-time job and doing this on the side in his evenings, who clearly wasn't checked, but he didn't check the generative AI output, but then his output wasn't checked either, so by the people above him. So it was really embarrassing, and the CEO of Chicago Public Media had to come out and say exactly what happened. And she said this should be a great learning moment for journalism. So in particular, what she learned is, I've lost the part of what she learned, but in particular, what she said she learned is that they didn't label that this content was not made by them, and they didn't check. So that really gives us a few lessons for this. Where I say it's messy when you're talking about generative AI and human in the loop is actually this is partly just exposing a vulnerability of a previous workflow, right? That you had 4 different chains who had a freelancer who they didn't really know, who didn't tell them that he'd used generative AI. So here's a few things. When you're using human in the loop, first of all, you have to check the generative AI output. You have to tell your colleagues you are using generative AI. So what that tends to mean is you have some principles and you tell them, but when your colleague is checking your content, it's different when they know you've used generative AI to when you haven't. And you have to label, so what Melissa said is that she's going to start labeling the content made by third parties. So this is more labeling, not necessarily of generative AI, but labeling of content provenance generally. We might see more of that. And there are tons of examples of this causing a problem for other publishers. Wired has come out and said, we're really sorry, we published an article by a freelancer who just completely made it up, presumably using generative AI. Business Insider have come out and said they've used a freelancer and then had to pull that article as well. And I think what we're learning is that it's more efficient to lie nowadays, so you probably need a closer relationship with your freelancers. It may mean you have to pay them a livable wage, and that's another issue in the news industry as well, if we need to reconsider payment of freelancers. So there were the cautionary tales. Let's look at some success stories of using generative AI in newsrooms. So here is Susie Glasman, the reporter for North Glen Thornton Sentinel. She's written a story about how a school board is going to sell a piece of land for $9 million. And this is how she got the story. She got the story using a tool called CGov, which monitors public meetings. For her, it monitors 12 school boards, and it transcribes, it summarizes, and it sends her notifications through email that the school board meeting has happened. So for her, what generative AI has done here is it's surfaced some information that otherwise she wouldn't have otherwise found. She told me she wouldn't have otherwise found this story. And she went back to the transcript, and then she wrote the story on that. And likewise, so we're seeing a lot of these public meeting monitoring tools. And Sam Gonzalez-Kelly from the Houston Chronicle also used a different public meeting monitoring tool. This one, he used Assembly, which is an in-house tool by Hearst, who own Houston Chronicle. And likewise, he couldn't actually get into this council meeting because it was too full. But he went back to the transcript and found out that they had stopped a ban on building houses. So in this town, there was a ban on building new houses because they were scared they're going to run out of water. And this council meeting announced the stop on that ban, and he wrote this feature on it, and he and Susie, they both have something in common in that both of their tools helped them very easily go back to the original source and verify. So So the generative AI helped them surface that information, but then they could go back and verify very early on in finding their stories. So this is the key part of if you are going to be a human in the loop, using generative AI to surface stories. Then after seeing an interesting element in a summary or transcript, the human in the loop listens back to the transcript to check for accuracy. They go back to the original source. So we're talking about success stories. This is a picture of people winning an award, so it must be successful, right? These guys are the team from iTromsø, which is a very small newspaper in northern Norway, and they also used generative AI to surface information. So they had a human tip-off. They had a very sad story of reader and I believe staff member whose baby had died in hospital, and they were looking at how the hospital staffing was was going on, if there's something wrong going on there, a systemic failure there, and they didn't really know what they were looking for. So they took a massive trove of public documents about the hospitals, and they put them through OpenAI and Anthropic and asked a very vague question. They just asked what are the most severe cases of, I think they asked what are the most severe cases of neglect. And of course, bear in mind these large language models can't actually answer that question accurately, but they can just surface something. And this is what they did. They surfaced this one case of this disciplinary, these emails going between a radiologist and their manager, which exposed that this radiologist, who was meant to be looking at the x-rays of potential people with cancer, was just looking at them really quickly, like 20 seconds. And then, so that was how they surfaced the information they wouldn't have otherwise known to look for. And then after that, what they did is they worked closely with a Swedish newspaper to ascertain that this person was working from home. They were working for the Norwegian hospitals, and they were working with Swedish hospitals who didn't have the same timetables or coordinate. So it was perfectly possible that they were actually working for both at the same time. So they wrote up that story and got this award for that work. And the key part, I think, of how they worked well with generative AI is, again, they used generative AI really early on in the story-making process. They had plenty of opportunity to verify, to check, and also they just used it as a tip-off, and then they looked for additional proof using their old reporting skills, their traditional reporting skills, and collaborating with another newsroom as well. So the next success story is in German. I don't speak German, but this is going to be fine, honestly. So this is from the Austrian press agency, and what this is an infographic which shows inflation in Austria, and you can see it's going down between 23 and 25, and then it's broken down the different industries. So let's see. Will I be able to? So what I want to play you, if I can, is the alt text. That's the text that a screen reader for blind people would read out if it was reading this. Now, do you think you can click on this play button, or can I? How do I do it? Just once.
Inflation in Austria SVG, image. Change in consumer prices compared to the previous year, in percent. 08/2302/2408/2402/2502468103. 2 selected sectors. February 2025 restaurants, hotels, housing, water, energy, inflation rate, food, fuels +6, 0 +5, 2 +3, 2 +2, 6 -3, 6 graphic, copyright APA, source, Statistic Austria inflation in Austria.
Okay, so that was like gobbledygook to me. Oh yeah, I should have said it was translated into English just for the purpose of this presentation, although that didn't make any difference to me. So what it's doing is just trying to read the things that are there, and it's not very useful to a blind person who wants to know what this story is. So they used OpenAI to put the infographics through, and let's see. If I can go to the next one.
The infographic illustrates the development of inflation in Austria from August 2023 to February 2025, and the price changes in selected sectors in February 2025. The inflation rate decreased from approximately 7% to 3.2%. In February 2025, prices for gastronomy and hotels increased by 6%, for housing, water, and energy by 5.2%, and for food by 2.6%. Fuel prices decreased by 3.6%. Source, Statistics Austria.
So if you couldn't hear that, it's quite difficult to hear. Basically, what OpenAI has done is told the most significant part of that of that graph rather than just reading out numbers. So inflation rate decreased from approximately 7%, for example, it says instead. So why this is a good use of the human in the loop is because the person who would have written that alt text would have been an infographics editor. So the person checking OpenAI, they've already made that graph, that chart, so they know that subject. So it's very quick for them to check the accuracy of the output of generative AI. And then conversely, because they're an infographics editor, they're good at design, their first skill is not writing. So they wouldn't necessarily be quicker than generative AI to write the text. It might be different if it's a writer. So the way I put that is the medium of the Gen AI content wasn't the human in the loop's primary skill. So you've got those two elements. They can check the subject matter, but they're not that quick at making the content in the medium you want it, in this case, in a piece of text description. And then thirdly, they have long enough time to meaningfully check the facts. This is a really important one because you're just paying lip service. If you say to a journalist, okay, you have 20 stories, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a press release, I'm going to put it through ChatGPT, make it into a news story. You then have to read the press release, read the news article, and check for the facts. And then you have to do the same next for a completely different story. You have 17 minutes to do that from beginning to end. You have to do 20 stories within a day. If you ask them to do that, they do not have enough time to check the facts meaningfully. That is just lip service. They were not doing this. They have 2,000 infographics a year. They had worked out they have enough time to meaningfully check those facts. And actually, they found that they wanted to do the same thing, make alt text for photos, but they haven't done that because they won't have enough time to check those facts for accuracy. That is the main point of when you're bringing in a human in the loop to check for accuracy when you use generative AI. And I think that brings me dead on 12. So do connect with me on LinkedIn and ask me any questions. Sorry I didn't have time to tell you anymore.
Hi, my name is Yulia, and I have a question related to the cases you showed when there was some mistakes with Gen AI, with using Gen AI. Is it really a problem that AI was used in these cases? Because a lot of examples there was in between of relationship of newsroom and some freelance journalist. But even before AI was a thing, in any industries, we had a shit ton of problems when turns out that even award-winning stories was completely made up, or a person was making up the stories for years. So maybe the AI as a tool is not a problem, but we have some other issue in newsroom as the structure or a system of working with people.
Yeah, I think what the introduction of generative AI is doing is exposing the vulnerabilities within newsrooms, in this case, specifically with how we use freelancers, yeah. But it is also allowing people to lie more efficiently. And it does seem to be an increase in freelancers lying. So